Good morning, everyone. I'd like to get the proceedings underway. 50 years since the referendum. I'd like to start the morning with Auntie Agnes doing a welcome to country.
Well, good morning, everyone. At least you can see me from here. Normally I'm behind a lectern and they can't see me. I'm Auntie Agnes Shea, and I'm very proud and honoured to be invited here today to welcome you all for this very special gathering. And I'm doing this on behalf of my daughter Annette, who's with me, and all the other Ngunnawal families. I'll say a bit about the elders, and then I'll just go on a bit about the community. I'd like to start off by acknowledging all of our distinguished guests, especially all of our professors, and ladies and gentlemen, and a very special welcome to all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island friends and our non-Indigenous friends. Elders from our many family groups have joined together to form the United Ngunnawal Elders Council, and it's called UNIQUE for short. And I am a founding member of the council. As a senior Ngunnawal elder living in Canberra, I am proud that Ngunnawal country, with its limestone plains, surrounded by beautiful mountain ranges and mighty flowing rivers, have supported the Ngunnawal people since the dream time. We pay our respects to the neighbouring tribes, who are the Gundungurra on the northeast, the Ewing on the east side, Wiradjuri to the west, the Wongaloos to the south, and the Ngarigo to the southeast. There are other Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples from many nations around the country and the world who have come to live on Ngunnawal land, and I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to them also. The Ngunnawal people have hosted many meetings and ceremonies for our neighbours to share stories of land, law and culture, and arrange marriages and initiations. Ngunnawal people also welcome neighbours to come together to strengthen our economy, social, cultural, spiritual and religious practices. In this place we sang together and danced together. Through ceremonies our young people became wise people. The sky and the earth gave us food and water. It has fed and cared for our Ngunnawal people from the first time they began together and set down the law in the valley and hills that we today call Canberra. Ngunnawal people have always lived here on the land that is now commonly known as the Australian capital. Our homeland also includes New South Wales and the surrounding region. Welcome to country is an ancient protocol and gives permission for non-Ngunnawal people to come on our land, and a welcome ensures that our spirit and our ancestors provide protection and safe passage while living on Ngunnawal land. And I want to thank our Ngunnawal ancestors for the care, protection and respect that they gave to this land, and for leaving it in good condition for our generations to use today. My dream is that present and future generations can live and walk this land in harmony with all people who live here, without fear of racism or discrimination. So I thank you all again. Sorry I can't stay and enjoy your lovely gathering, but Annette's got an appointment at the doctor's. But I'd just like to say thank you again to everyone. Have a good gathering, good meeting. And I'd just like to say something to Professor Peter Randolph. Behave yourself. So, and now I'll finish in the language of the Ngunnawal people, Ngana, Yarrabai, Yangu, which means you're welcome to leave your footprints on our land now, or in other words, welcome to Ngunnawal country. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll talk for 10, 15 minutes, and then what I'll try and do at the end of the panel, because Chris has got to go, he's got another engagement, perhaps if you could hit Chris with some questions after he speaks, and then we'll get into it. But before I bring Chris up here, I'd like to tell you how I first met Chris. Chris was the new boy at Cherbourg High School, and I was involved in the Racism in Schools project for the Department of Education at Queensland. And I was working with a wonderful man called John Budby. And John's unfortunately deceased now. But John was my mentor. And he was one of the greatest Aboriginal teachers because he was out there teaching in the 60s. He never put his hand up saying, I'm the first. He didn't believe in that. But I'll never forget when he introduced me to Chris. He said, this young boy, he's got a lot to learn, but he will go somewhere, you know. And I always wish I had heard Jod say that about me, because I think that was probably the greatest support that anyone could ever give to someone of Chris's calibre. Written several books. If you haven't read them, go out and buy them and read them. Do yourself a favour, as they say. An amazing person. He turned a school around from a wreck into the shining light, and it was fantastic to see that turnaround in education, because he did something that we've been trying to do at universities for so long, and that's put pride into Indigenous education and Indigenous knowledge, and Chris did it at the grassroots. Thank you. So without further ado, Chris, thank you.
Let me start just by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. I thank Auntie there for her welcome earlier. I noticed that she told Peter to behave himself, so I'm assuming that the rest of us don't have to worry about that, which is a good thing. You'll see me wearing black. I'm still in mourning after State of Origin. Anyway, I digress. I wanted to just say that I'm delighted to be at this forum. I apologise profusely for having to leave. You'll see me walk out the door at 5 to 11. Coming out of a psychology background, I think I thought it might be useful just to reflect on the notion of the relationship between Aboriginal Australia and subsequent Australians, shall we say. And in and around this conversation about recognition, and I kind of sort of cast an eye forward about the sorts of conversations that you're going to have. So I want to just kind of lay a backdrop in and around the relationship. And if you think about that moment of not necessarily first contact, but when Captain Cook and Governor Phillip and those people came out, that wasn't first contact. There are other cultures, other groups of people who'd been connecting with Indigenous Australians in a way that was honourable long before people came out from England. And that's interesting because when those other cultural groups came out out of Indonesia, out of other places, some 400 years before Cook and them, and I'm sure in earlier times, they acknowledged the presence of Aboriginal Australians, which is quite significant because with Governor Phillip and subsequent colonisers after that, there was the notion of terra nullius that was portrayed. And so against that background, as you'll all know, it was as if they were just pretending that we didn't exist. And clearly that's not the case. That has never been the case, that we did exist and we continue to exist. So it begs the question about how or why people would engage in that kind of manoeuvre of pretending that we don't exist. From an Aboriginal perspective, it's quite offensive actually, not only because our ancestors were slaughtered in that encounter, but there was no discussion about a treaty, no acknowledgement of us as human beings, and there was this continual sort of lie that was perpetuated to suggest that we didn't exist. It was a convenient lie because if nobody acknowledged that if there was no acknowledgement that we existed, then that kind of made it easier for them to encroach upon our land and just subtly take over. It'd be like, I don't know, if any of us own a big flash house with a little granny flat out the back, some squatters just turn up and they're in the backyard, and then the next thing they're in the granny flat, and then the next thing they're in our kitchen and our bedroom, and somehow you get squeezed out. It's the same kind of thing, that there was just no acknowledgement that we existed in the first place. So that's interesting, and I'm sure you'll get to talk about that. So think about that in the context of the relationship. You couldn't say that that was positive and that it laid the grounds for what I would talk about some years later about a high expectations relationship. You can't have an honourable relationship with people if you're not going to acknowledge that they exist. As time progressed, we got to a point where I suppose there was some acknowledgement that we existed as a people, but it existed in a reasonably destructive and kind of in a way that didn't particularly suit us as people. You know, there was, you know, people with goodwill, missionaries and all of that, who recognised that something had to be done about how we were described as the Aboriginal problem or something like that. So again, in a relationship, it's hard to contemplate a positive, a high expectations relationship if we're described as a problem, and we continue to be described as the problem. And so in that period, we saw a sense of probably the early days of that sort of welfare mentality kind of kicking in. And I only say that because we didn't start, as blackfellas, we didn't start this welfare mentality. It was started by other people for us, and we kind of got seduced into that circumstance. Whereas blackfellas, we were led into a kind of existence that depended on us being victims and other white Australians being the masters, so or the saviours. And think about that in the context of a relationship. You couldn't call that a high expectations relationship. And along the way, we continued to be sort of othered, if you like. And as time progressed, things like Gough Whitlam got elected as Prime Minister and wanted to change and address some of those circumstances. Malcolm Fraser as well, by investing in Aboriginal people to ameliorate some of the differences that occurred. And that nurtured a sense of anger, hatred, if you like, towards Aboriginal people, because all of a sudden you have a group of people who are accustomed to being privileged. When they see efforts to ameliorate that, get sucked into perceiving that as special treatment for other people, and them being privileged. And it's only because they're so accustomed to the status quo in which blackfellas were down here and they were up here. That's why you still see the legacy of that with people like Pauline Hanson and the way they talk, because there's complete ignorance about any of the complexities that exist. I won't get started on that one. But again, if you think of that in the context of a relationship, we were kind of cast as a despised other, and through that period this kind of nasty, filthy, negative stereotype emerged of us as a people, none of which is true, none of which has substance, if you understand who we are as a people in an authentic sense. And so, you know, it's easy to look at the surface and embrace what appears a truth, but the more you know blackfellas, the more you know that kind of negative stereotype lacks substance. It's complex. And again, so if you think of that in the context of the relationship, it's hard for us to be in a high expectations relationship in that circumstance if we are the despised other and we're perceived as the negative stereotype and as down here. So earlier, when Dennis referred to my work at Cherbourg School, I guess I came to that circumstance mindful of all of these sorts of dynamics. And the thing is this, as a blackfella, I'm happy to be cast as other. And as I explained to Cherbourg kids and other kids all around the country, I'm quite okay about being cast as other, as not a mainstream Australian. But the difference is I'm going to decide what kind of other I'm going to be, not you, not mainstream Australia. And so I will make the choice about what kind of other I will be, and I will assert that. And in the confines of a high expectations relationship, Australia just has to accept that. I'm not asking for people to feel sorry for me. I'm not asking people to do anything too special for me or anything like that. Just embrace me for who I decide who I am. And in the confines of a high expectations relationship, if you're able to do that, then I think we have a chance. And so I just share that with you as the basis for the conversations going forward. So that's me.
When we look at the concept of 50 years on from the referendum, and for those of us that watched your career blossom, where are you now, 50 years on, in your work, your concepts, and your ideologies?
Well, some of you won't believe this, but I'm turning 50 this year. You're probably thinking, no. So I was actually born in '67, which I think is really cool. Where am I now? It's probably the place I described, and I can tell you why. It's because I grew up in Bundaberg in the 1970s as a kid, and thankfully for me, I had a very strong and very proud Aboriginal mum, a very hard-working Italian father. I said Joe Bielke-Peterson was the premier. Behind us in our house, we've got a guy who throws rocks at us and calls my mum an old black gin, and over this side we've got a guy that calls us little black bastards. And we live in a time when we are being bombarded with this negative stereotypical view. Now thankfully my mum was able to allow us to transcend that kind of bullshit perception of who we are supposed to be as Aboriginal Australia, and amidst that we're able to assert that. I can't say the same for my extended family, and I can't explain why some of them weren't able to transcend some of those complexities. Only to say it must have been hard, and so I listen with contempt when I hear politicians say things like with racism, offence is taken, not given, as if it's the fault of the person who is feeling aggrieved by racism. And I think, well, I was about to swear then, but I'll try not to swear. I think that's fine, and that comes from a position of luxury. If you're not, if you're not being waterboarded with racism, then of course you can make a choice about whether you take offence or not. But when you've got a waterboarder or jammed down your throat consistently, then sometimes it's hard not to embrace that sense of offence and be aggrieved by that. So thanks to my mum, I've always been in a good space about who I am and the extent to which I'm recognised as an Indigenous Australian, and I'm strengthened by that. So when I know I'm on my country at home in Bundaberg, I'm strengthened by that, as my people are. And me personally, I don't need anybody to set me free or whatever. I am who I am. You accept me if you like. If you don't, I don't care. I'm still who I am. So I carry the blood of the first Australians.
What Chris doesn't tell you about, because he's so humble, is in his family he had some wonderful role models as well. Uncle Michael and a few others. Yeah, you had some great role models there. Next person I'd love to get up and have a talk, and Chris has got to go at 11, I believe. Yeah, I'll sneak out. Okay, yeah, as soon as you can. Good. Next person I want to get up and talk to us is Jessa Rogers. Now, Jessa is a hen's tooth in many ways. She's an assistant professor in education. Yep. Jessa's a Fulbright, and I'm a Fulbrighter. And in most universities that I've worked in, there's only ever been one Fulbrighter. To have two Aboriginal Fulbrighters in the one university is outstanding. So please, Jessa.
Thanks for having me today. Before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the land of the Ngunnawal people and their elders, past, present and future. And it's a great honour always to be here in Canberra, the country of my birth and conception. I was born here. I started school here. and I returned here to finish my Western education, my PhD at the ANU. Tēnā koe to Professor at the back and other Indigenous people here from New Zealand and elsewhere. It's always hard to follow Chris, one of my role models. I have very much walked in some of his footsteps, went to QUT, have dedicated my life to education after my own personal experiences, having, I guess, low expectations put on me as well. I was from a low-income family. I was pregnant at 16, grew up in Nambour in Queensland, one of only a few Aboriginal kids at my school, didn't learn anything about my own peoples at school, and felt outraged when I got to university and was taught by Gary McLennan and found out that there was a different way and a better way to educate our kids. So that's why I'm so passionate about Indigenous education, and that's really the space that I work in most of the time. But currently I work here at UC teaching teachers in creative arts, which is my other passion. It was amazing to be in the audience at Q&A the other night with a 38% Indigenous audience. Here in Canberra, we have such a small Indigenous population, and to sit around looking at almost 4 in every 10 people being Aboriginal was a really important moment for me. I felt empowered. I really felt the sense that I get sometimes when I go to New Zealand and see lots of brown faces. You really feel like you're part of something bigger. And to have that here in Canberra was absolutely amazing. The robust, respectful dialogue that happened, my previous boss, Noel Pearson, on the panel, along with other important people, really struck me. And I guess something that really stood out to me was the female presence, the Indigenous female presence. I'm glad to be breaking up a manel today. Often being the only woman on panels is a thing that happens, and being one of very few Aboriginal females here at this university is difficult. In academia that work as assistant professors and above. What Uluru stands for me, is that we, with all our differences as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, really needed to come together as one. Urban, remote, regional, wherever people have grown up, women, men, and otherwise, as equals, young people and elders sitting together at the table making decisions, not just the same voices, not another small advisory panel picked by 1 or 2 people, not just the Aboriginal voices, the Torres Strait Islander voices that always get asked. And the findings and the outcome and the statement were not surprising to most people. And Megan Davis actually said when she read the statement, when you looked across the 13 dialogues that happened before Uluru, there was always community and a consensus from Mob that we wanted treaty. Mob have always wanted a parliamentary voice, and that these things have been advocated for a long time. And so I guess today we're asking, where are we and where are we going? And people that know me know that I've always supported treaty. I really am, I guess, committed to having a seat at the table, and I just published an article yesterday with SBS about that concept of dedicated seats in Parliament for Indigenous people. It happens in New Zealand. It's, I guess, lucky at the moment that we've got a number of Indigenous voices in Parliament in both houses, but for a long time we've had one or even no voices in Parliament, and really that's where our decisions are made in this country. I've got 3 main reasons why I think it's important that we do have those dedicated seats. It guarantees us representation. They're elected by our own people, and it increases our voice in decision making. It ensures our voice at the table. We've got enough advisory bodies, we've got enough committees. Having another body that gives advice that our government can give or take is not enough for me, and it's not enough for Indigenous people. We deserve a real voice. I do believe that Uluru's statement is right when it says the nature of our problem is structural. I firmly believe that, and nothing changes if nothing changes. We've got the same structures. We need structural change. It's not enough to have simple recognition of our people put in the Constitution. And as I've said, it's not enough to have another advisory group or body. We need power, and we need it fast. We need power to make change for our own people. And a bit of context, back in July 2015, and this process has been going on nearly a decade, Abbott and Shorten both met with a number of 40 actually Indigenous leaders that they had invited. And even back then, the consensus and the statement that was released was that our people reject minimalist and symbolic recognition in the Constitution, and that our people want substantive change. So here we are, this is where we're going. I guess the last point on my list of things that I would like to hear conversation around today is treaty, and why is it such a difficult concept for non-Indigenous and also Indigenous people to discuss. There are treaties that have been in existence for a long time. We've got the US, we've got New Zealand, but there's also treaty making happening in Canada, modern treaty making, not historical, or, you know, it's not too far gone. It's not too hard for us to make decisions that could help our people have more power in our own lives, which is what this is really about. And really for me, treaty is about resetting that relationship between government and First Peoples and having a chance for an equal relationship, or as close to as possible. So that's basically my notes for today and my introductory statements. I'm looking forward to the dialogue that happens on our panel. And thanks for having me.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our Chancellor. The first time I met Tom was in the men's bathroom at Alice Springs Airport. I had looked at the man for many, many years, and I'd actually been quite a radical and was very critical of him. We met in the bathroom at Alice Springs Airport, and as men do, we just said g'day and that sort of stuff. And he said to me, "Well, what are you doing up here, Dennis?" And I thought, wow, he knows me. It wasn't until 2 hours later I realised that I had a name badge on. And that's where I first met Tom. But his leadership, his involvement in Australia has been outstanding. And unless you didn't read your University of Canberra news, you would know that Tom is actually on a stamp. Now, it's a fantastic stamp, yep. The first Aboriginal man that was on a stamp was Junkerai, often called 1 Pound Jimmy. And so Tom is following in great steps because he was an incredible leader and a survivor of the Coniston Massacre. So with no further ado, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
I thought I'd start off with just a little clip to put it into perspective of why we're here.
Australia has the world's oldest human civilization. But we've achieved a lot recently too. We were one of the first countries to give women the vote. We showed the world what mateship means. And did it again down the track. We tackled the world's biggest engineering project. Said no to the White Australia policy. And yes to Aboriginal rights. Then we put on the best Olympics ever. Every Australian generation's done something great. Now it's our turn. Our chance to do something our kids can be proud of. Constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is not the end of the journey. It's just the next important step. So let's take it together. Authorised by Kay Mundine, Reconciliation Australia, Sydney.
Firstly, apologies for coming in late and missing the other presenters, but my flight out of Sydney this morning was cancelled with an aircraft that was unserviceable. And the irony is that just 2 weeks ago I was going out of Canberra and did the same. And so I don't know whether I should continue to fly, in case I don't realise it's unserviceable till we're in the air. But apologies to the other presenters for missing your presentations. Can I begin by acknowledging we're on the land of the Ngunnawal peoples and the Ngambri people and other claimants who are the traditional owners of this country, and pay respects to elders past and present, but also to recognise other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here in this room. And as I always like to do is to recognise their youth and all youth, because youth are going to be our future leaders, the custodians of our stories, our cultures, our histories, our languages, and it's really important that we recognise that. And for some of us older members of the audience and community is to create those pathways and level that support to people to allow them to be able to come through, particularly the young. Thank you to Nexus and also the school for creating the opportunity to talk about this, very, I think, important round of conversations about reconciliation and recognition, and it's very timely because we're in National Reconciliation Week. It's been 26 years since a formal reconciliation process began in Australia with the establishment of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. And over that time, many people, both Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous Australians, have dedicated their energy, passion, skills and knowledge to the reconciliation movement. And awareness has been raised. Relationships with numerous sectors and industries have been built, and commitments and plans have been put in place. And as a result, we've taken steps, both large and small, towards the ideal or the idea of reconciliation, or what the Council described as a united Australia that respects this land of ours, values the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage and provides justice and equality for all. Now, when the Council came to the end of its term, one of its final recommendations was to establish an independent body to continue its work and to be the nation's custodian of reconciliation. And so 17 years ago, Reconciliation Australia was born, and I co-chair with Melinda Salento Reconciliation Australia. Over the years, we've refined a holistic concept of what reconciliation means to this country, and drawing on the knowledge of those who came before us and those who continue to walk with us on this journey, we've developed a roadmap for achieving our vision of a just, equitable and reconciled nation. Last year we released the first State of Reconciliation in Australia report, and it's the first report of its kind since the Council's final report in 2000. Our report highlighted what Australia had achieved in 25 years of a formal reconciliation process and where we still have to go. Importantly, and for the first time, it defined 5 critical dimensions that together represent a holistic and comprehensive picture of reconciliation. And they are, firstly, race relations, where positive two-way relationships build on trust and respect and exist between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous Australians. Inequity and equality, where Indigenous Australians participate equally in life opportunities and their or our unique rights are recognised and upheld. Institutional integrity, where our political, business, community institutions actively support all dimensions of reconciliation. Unity, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, histories and rights are valued as part of our shared national identity. And historical acceptance, where all Australians understand and accept our nation's full history and agree the wrongs of the past will never be repeated. So today, we use the 5 dimensions of reconciliation as a framework for discussion, action and measuring progress. To understand reconciliation is to understand the interrelationship of the dimensions of those dimensions, and we'll only see progress towards a reconciled nation when we experience mutual progress across each of the 5 dimensions. But there is cause for optimism. Since 2008, Reconciliation Australia has been conducting a national biennial research study, the Australian Reconciliation Barometer. Now, the barometer surveys both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander samples, as well as a nationally representative general Australian population sample. It measures attitudes and perceptions towards reconciliation and maps our progress across the 5 dimensions of reconciliation. In some areas, the survey provides evidence of progress and cause for optimism for our national journey towards reconciliation, but in others, it exposes how far we still have to go. The 2016 barometer revealed a substantial increase in the number of people in the general community who think that the relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous people is very important. Up from 48% in 2014 to 76% in 2016. And it's encouraging to see a growing appreciation of the value of positive race relations. Barometer results also reveal that in 2016, 39% of the country of the general population in the country agreed that Australia is a racist country. So that's 39%. Now this may appear to be a negative result, but for me it's a result that shows that more Australians now recognise the challenges of racism in our society. And it's very difficult to talk about or resolve if issues... it's difficult to resolve an issue if people don't at least acknowledge that the issue exists, and that's the importance of that statistic. The other dimension where I see cause for optimism is unity. The 2016 barometer revealed wide agreement amongst Australians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are important to Australia's identity as a nation, and that it's possible to become united. But we do recognise that more has to be done. Unfortunately, the 2016 Reconciliation Barometer also revealed areas where we're not achieving, and in fact have gone backwards in terms of improving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lived experience in racism. Racism, both perceived and actual, is increasing. In the 6 months of the survey period, 37% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants experienced verbal racial abuse. This is a 6% increase over the 2014 survey results. Now, based on these results, if all of us in this room were an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, every second or third person would have been verbally abused in racial terms since Christmas. Increased racism is reported to occur across a number of settings, including the workplace. 18% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people surveyed experienced racism in interactions with employers, and that was up from 13%, so that's a 5% increase. 20% also experienced racism in interactions with local shop owners, up from 14% in 2014 to a very shocking 29% in the last survey, so that's a very significant increase. It's unsurprising then that a greater percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people agree that Australia is a racist country, that's 57% of us, than only 39% of the general community. But in terms of equality and equity, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are more likely to feel that there are barriers to participating equally in a range of life opportunities as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Statistically, from the moment we are born, the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians has already started, and that's before we layer in prejudice and discrimination. So despite this, as many as 1/3 of survey respondents from the general community believe that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are responsible for their or our own disadvantage. However, many Australians also believe that more should be done by community, businesses, governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations to reduce problems of prejudice and racism. 58% of people believe governments should do more, and 47% also think that corporates can do more to overcome prejudice. So let's look at a call to action. While negative survey results from the Australian Reconciliation Barometer can at times be depressing, it should also be a rally call to action for each and every one of us. It's not acceptable to have any group in our community experiencing increasing levels of racism. It's not acceptable for Australia's First Nations peoples to feel they cannot be true to their culture and personal beliefs. And it's not acceptable to continue to let these things stop Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from contributing fully and uniquely to Australian society. So the 5 dimensions of reconciliation offer us a framework for action. Each of us can reflect on these dimensions: race relations, equality and equity, institutional integrity, unity and historical acceptance, and resolve to take a step to improve our own understanding of these issues and adopt behaviours that support a more just, equitable and reconciled Australia. The State of Reconciliation report offers us hope in that so many Australians view the relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and the wider community as important, and so many believe it's possible for us to become a united country. National Reconciliation Week 2017 is an opportunity to reflect on the anniversaries of those 2 very significant events in our history: the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum and the 25th anniversary since the Mabo decision. And it's also an opportunity to picture what might be ahead of us for the next 25 to 50 years. Now, as you're here, you're interested in Indigenous affairs, and you would have seen the Uluru statement last week. I think it's well worth a read if you haven't already had that opportunity. It's one that sets out clearly, recognising that it's only the views of those who were there. They're not necessarily, they're reflective, but they're not representative of all of the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. But just the key issues in there that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have articulated are very key, and I'm sure that we'll pick up on those in the questions or in other presentations. The whole process with the Referendum Council is going to be an interesting one. You know, having undertaken all the consultations, received hundreds and hundreds of submissions, they've now got to digest that in the next month and provide a report to government. And governments will then have to consider it and work out the way forward and what they'll do. And you might recall that Ken Wyatt and Nova Peris previously were taking the lead in Parliament to develop up, if there was going to be a referendum question or a process, what that would be. But Nova's now left, and so we've got 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander politicians in Parliament. The good thing is that even though they're from different parties, they've all pledged to work together, and in a very apolitical way and a very non-partisan way, which is, I think, going to be a next very important step for the whole of the Parliament to then take note of what they're doing. But I think it'll be yet to be tested to see how much authority they can exert on the Parliament. But we already see now from the statements of various politicians and commentators following Uluru that they're only partly informed about the process to come, and they've already started shooting off, and most of them are ill-informed. So it's really a time to just contemplate what's been said and try and hear the other voices. And you'll also see that the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, that is a representative body, that is an elected body, that's comprising of over 9,000 members, and 180 Aboriginal organisations around the country are now going to start to ramp up their activities to demonstrate that there are some additional models that may not have been currently proposed, but that's the time to see. So thank you for taking part in this collective journey towards reconciliation today, and I encourage you to continue on your journey. I really look forward to hearing the other presentations, because these sort of dialogues are really important to get the issues out. And as I've said at quite a number of forums, it doesn't stop in just coming and getting informed here. It's about how you can then take the information that you get at forums like this and start to disseminate amongst the community, amongst your family, and get people on board. We have got a very healthy attitude, even though I said there's a lot of racism out there, but in general terms, it's a very positive disposition towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So thank you for your participation, and I look forward to the questions. Thanks.
I'd like to introduce Peter Radoll as our last speaker, and then we'll have a short period of time for the free professors, because one day, very soon, you will be a professor. Trust me. Peter.
Thank you, Dennis, very much, brother. Thank you.
I won't tell you where I first met Peter.
There's a reason why Art said behave yourself, Peter. That's true. Yeah, you know when your family when Aunt Agnes says to you in a public forum, make sure you behave yourself. Oh, too funny. Just want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people today, and pay respects to their elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room today. I thought I might just talk briefly on my experience of recognition and constitutional reform, something I was quite naive about, living in country New South Wales before I came to Canberra and came to university. In 1996, I left it perfectly, as what my family said to me once, and they're quite real. They said to me, "Why would you leave a perfectly good motor mechanic job to go to university?" And I thought, that's a really good question, actually. I wonder why I should do that. But they were true. They thought it was a waste of time going to university, complete waste of time. In some ways it was, really, wasn't it? Nah, not at all. But in my journey here as an undergraduate student was quite incredible. There was an opportunity here in 1998. There was a constitutional, I don't know, Tom, was you here in 1998 in Australia? You're still overseas then, that's right. There was a constitutional recognition and reform conference at Old Parliament House. And as part of that, I met an incredible person, someone who I admired for a very long time from a distance, Uncle Chicka Dixon. Spoke with great vigour and vibrance about the importance of a treaty and the importance of being recognised in our constitution. This is 1998. It's a long time before, I suppose, the current recognition movement. But what I'd come to learn, because I was quite naive, coming from country, is that this recognition, or constitutional recognition and reform, has been going on for an incredibly long time. This is nothing new. It's not a new thing. It's not new at all. And in fact, that night, Uncle Chicka needed a lift home back to his hotel. And of course I had, 1970 Toyota Corona. That was barely going. Like plumbers have the worst plumbing in the house. Ex-motor mechanics have the worst cars on earth. Different these days. It was just barely going, and as a student as well. So I managed to very embarrassingly put him in my car, and we drove to his hotel, and we spent the next many hours. It was before mobile phones. I admit it was before mobile phones. So it was about 2 o'clock when I left his hotel room, and he'd imparted a lot of wisdom at that time. Quite naive about the world. That morning, I convinced him to come along because I was doing the. Does anyone do student radio programs still today? No one does, do they? Okay, so I did that still today, at that point. I had a weekly radio program on the Saturday and Saturday mornings. Here, it's a ridiculous hour of the morning. Started at 6 and finished about 9. I don't know if anyone listened, but I enjoyed it. And he came along and I recorded that interview. It was the most amazing interview that I've, and the most highest, or someone who I admired incredibly. He told me many things, that his aspirations were for us to be recognised in the Constitution, and then one day that we would have some sort of treaty and make sure and correct the wrongs of the past. I never really considered that, how that might look, what that looked like. So I did ask him what it looked like, and he said that we should be able to make the decisions. We should be able to veto policies and laws that didn't gel with us, that made us, as Chris was talking about earlier, that sort of put us in the deficit rather than the positive. It is incredible to think that that was back in 1998. It seems like so long ago now. And I was such a, as a second year university student at that point in time. If you fast forward a little bit, just recently, I was asked to go along by the Ngunnawal elders invited me, I believe, or the Referendum Council, for the 13th Referendum Council. For some reason, Referendum Council decided to only have 12 dialogues, but luckily some of our community leaders here in the ACT convinced them. They went to the Sydney one and convinced them that Canberra needs to have this Referendum Council here. We need to have a dialogue here to get our input. So I went along to that, and I was quite naive again, because I thought the Referendum Council and Recognise were much more aligned in their views and aspirations than what they really are. The reality is, the Referendum Council and Recognise are a long way apart in terms of view and approach. And it got to me the point. I got to the point during that process where I thought these are not only two very different views, but somehow they become fractured. And somehow, through the wonderful, you guys some of you won't be surprised because I'm quite got an avid interest in social media and information technology. But somehow we've managed to have a huge undermining of the constitutional recognition agenda, because of the fracture between what the Referendum Council is looking at and what Recognise stands for. And so anyone that's pro anything to do with constitutional recognition is tagged with a "we hate recognise" brush. And in fact, but the constitutional reform and the referendum council's view is quite different. They're open to the idea of a treaty. They're open to not minimalist recognition, but serious, real recognition in the Constitution that will make a real difference for us. So that was a shock to me, to understand that we have these mechanisms out there that no one's really well informed about. And I'm not stupid. Well, I don't think I am. I'm not stupid, but I just didn't have and I've read a lot about recognise and referendum council, constitutional recognition. Been doing this reading this stuff for a long time. But then to realise how badly wrong I was and how badly ill-informed I was, even though I've read a lot about the whole thing, I thought, well, what's the rest of Australia feeling? And it really surprised me, thinking, what is the rest of Australia feeling? The other aspect I just want to share, so I was confused by that. The other aspect I want to share is about 4 years ago when we started having, I suppose, when the recognition movement became more prominent. I decided to go to meet some elderly people. I live at Bungendore. So I thought I'd go and have a chat to a couple of neighbours. Now, Bungendore's not ultra conservative, but let's just say it's a country town. It's not, and it has country town views. Put it that way. So that's a nice way of saying it. And so I actually spoke to these two very, very elderly ladies. They're in their 80s, late 80s. And so I said to them, now tell me about 1967 referendum. What did it mean for you, and what did it mean for Aboriginal people? They knew I identified as Aboriginal, they know. Anyway, so what it meant to them was that we fixed everything. 100%, it's all done. And when we started talking about constitutional reform now and recognition at that time, they were very perplexed about why do we have to go back and revisit this, we've already fixed it. I've done my bit, I've helped the Aborigines out, that's all we need to do, we don't need any more. And then when I sat down and spoke to her about this, she said, I hadn't realised that it didn't do anything really for Aboriginal people. She thought that it fixed every issue on earth for our mob. And again, I thought, that made me wonder again then, how do old people get, or elderly people should say, I'll be this soon. How do elderly people become informed about this as well? How do we inform elderly people about, because they're not on social media, they don't really care much about social media. They're in their little clubs and societies. How do we inform those people about what's going on in Australia and how we actually get connected? It's really interesting. It's really interesting to have what recognition really looks like to different parts of the community. That's what I finish off just with I suppose something that was really amazing. Anyone who went to Q&A on Monday night was an absolutely incredible night. The first question was asked by Professor Dennis Foley. He set the scene, which was absolutely amazing. And the last question, for those who don't know, the last question was asked by my daughter. And an incredibly proud moment. But I think, the question was scripted. But I think something that I took away from my daughter, which is it's always important to learn from the youth, I suppose, was what she said. Does anyone remember what she said right at the end when Tony asked her a question? She asked, she said, to hear from the elders or the panelists that what we're doing in terms of how we're travelling is great, and that we've got to continue the fight, and to listen, that was very inspiring. And I think that's the truth, and I think I reflect back to listening to Uncle Chicka Dixon when those hours they were spent in the hotel room. My family thought I had died or something seriously happened to me. There's no mobile phone, so I couldn't contact them and tell them something. Well, I was going to leave Uncle there. I'm not going to get this opportunity again in my lifetime, and I never did. But he's saying the same thing. He said, it's up to the youth to make the changes. It's up to the youth to put the message out there. He said it was too late for us. When that was in 1998, he thought it was too late for him to put the message out there. So he's passing the baton on to me. And now I get the opportunity to pass it on to my daughter. I think, in recognition, what is recognition? I think, and like Jessa mentioned earlier, there are treaties all over the world. I actually visited Canada probably 7 or 8 times now. I've been very lucky to travel extensively. But there was one trip I did a couple of years ago that was incredible. I went and visited 3 universities, University of Saskatchewan, University of Nevada, and University of British Columbia. Their presidents of the universities, when we met with them, the Vice Chancellors, when we met with them, they all said, welcome to Treaty 4 territory, Treaty 8 territory. We got to UBC, University of British Columbia, and their president said, welcome to the unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And that's the most powerful message I've ever heard. And I'm thinking, wouldn't it be great if our Vice Chancellors and our non-Indigenous leaders and Vice Chancellors would actually welcome international guests onto unceded territories of the Ngunnawal people? Wouldn't that be fabulous? Recognition is just more than just a document. Recognition is more than just a legislative process. It's about every one of us. We can do that every single day very, very easily.
Everyone. My question is around, I suppose, what I would call discourses of risk in our public discourse. Since the Uluru Statement, I've heard, I suppose, on one hand, a deathly silence from the white political leadership, and on the other hand, in our public media, a continual reference to a rejection of recognition.
Excuse me.
And I suppose my question is, in this sort of conservative, risk-averse political climate that we're in, what might be the next steps for having the difficult conversation, having the complex conversation that we need to have?
Well, I'm happy to go. Yeah, we're in the panel now, are we? I don't think you're having a go. Peter was still responding. Yeah, look, we're on part of a journey. This is, Uluru was just one step in that whole process, and what's going to happen out of a lot of people who went to Uluru don't quite know what's really was the outcome at Uluru, and so they're waiting on finding out what was written up to see if they agree or don't agree with that, with what was stated. And for external commentators, I think we're just shooting in the wind sometimes. That's what we think might have happened down there. But from what I hear, it was a very good process, and people got together. But as I said earlier, there was Uluru, which came on the back of all those other consultations that they've had, all the submissions that are going to go in, and that's just one process. They've got to provide a report to government, but government doesn't only have one source of, not government, I should say the Parliament, because it's going to both the government and the opposition. But that's not going to be their only source of advice that they'll get. They've still got to look at what came out of the expert panel and what comes from other commentators like RA, like the National Congress, who will all have inputs.
Just a short response, Kerry, to that. One of the things I like to do is push the point a little bit within the roles that I do have. And particularly the 2 staff in the Office of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Leadership would see I do that quite a bit. And see what the reaction is. So I put ideas out. So I'm not saying that universities are necessarily a barometer of where we are as a society, but it gives me an idea of how far I can push, and then maybe where the gains can be made elsewhere in terms of outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait community. It is interesting to find universities, often think universities are quite progressive, but often we're just made up of humans from society, I suppose. So I think as a whole, I think we are, but I think as individuals, we're probably not as progressive as we think we are. So I think the flavour for a treaty or for very progress policy is still very difficult. I think there's an aspiration for that, but the implementation and the follow-through, we're always in a terrible great hurry. We never really got the time to have the conversations and the dialogue that we need to actually bed things down. And then there's other external factors that put pressure on us, funding, and timelines to go to print for different things. So there's all these interesting things that prevent us from having the conversations and the dialogues that we need to actually make sure we're better than what we really are, than what we are at the moment.
And, sorry, I just want to pick up on that. It's really a procedural issue in that, because there's there's some commentary about that recognise is gone, and you know, we're onto treaty. But the reality is that you know, if we're looking at constitutional reform, you can't just plonk, for example, this independent Aboriginal body into the Constitution without saying why it's in there and who the people are that it's representing. So recognition will still be part of that process, and whatever comes out of the you know, the various discussions, what's key is that the Parliament will look at the issues of whether we have a referendum or not and what the questions will be. And if, at the end of the day, if there's going to be a lot of opposition or if it's a close call, nothing will progress, because, you know, even though we as the people of Australia have the final say in the election, every other constitution, every other reform and referendum has shown that unless there's strong support by both the government and the opposition and the Parliament, it's not going to get through anyhow.
I'm just sort of thinking around the issues of the first with the Constitution. It's basically an administrative document for a customs union, and this recognition would be the first sort of moral part of the Constitution, as I would see it. But then the idea of treaty being established beforehand gives opportunities for a sort of separate parliamentary system similar to New Zealand and so on. There's so many different issues. Where does the leadership in choosing, and as you said with referenda, if you don't have the question, if we look back to 98, for example, John Howard organised a question that would certainly lose. Yeah. You know, it was guaranteed to lose. Everyone knew that. So it was, you know, and if we're to avoid that, we need leadership. Now, I don't want to draw parallels again with multiculturalism, but in terms of leadership, look at the Muslim community. They're badged as this one big group, and the government says you're the leader, and that just doesn't work with the whole religious organisation. Doesn't work that way. I remember Chris speaking once before about Aboriginal leadership and subtle differences and so on. And when you spoke before, Chancellor, you said reflective as opposed to representative. I just wondered, in terms of how do you choose the one course that will win in a referendum? And how do you know who is really a leader of the people, as opposed to some bloke, rather than woman, that the government chose? And is there some sort of tension there, and how is that resolved? I'm sorry, I know that's a big question, and if you're solving it, we'll get up. So.
Well, the reality is that the only body that's representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. It's an independent body, independent to government, and it goes out to the Indigenous population to vote on who the membership's going to be. But very clearly, you know, we're very unique in that we're a company limited by guarantees, so governments can't shut us down. We control it. We have mandated 50% women across our total structure, and we have an ethics council which sits independent to the Congress, and you know, the real interest is that myself and Megan Davis co-chair the ethics council. Now Megan's on the referendum council, so it's we've got a few challenges to come up in that process, but we look at any business that the National Congress conducts to make sure that it's ethical and that it's not going to contravene any of the legislations. There's no other body like that in the nation that's got it. So there's you know, over 9,000 individual members and 180 organisations are members, and that's increasing. When you start to take those 180 peak bodies and so forth, you've got a massive group. Nearly all the land councils are on board. New South Wales Land Council, which is the single biggest entity, they're part of it, so they have a massive structure as well under them. So, you know, we've managed to convince the Prime Minister, because Minister Scullion had said he wasn't funding any longer, but we've got the Prime Minister to overturn that and give some funding to the National Congress, and more that'll happen. And so when we're talking about an independent body, representative body, you know, it's very likely that could be a body like Congress as the representative body. So, but we've got a long way to go. You know, it's early days. But as far as leadership goes, yeah, there's some strong leadership out there, and you've got the leaders who are appointed by entities like the Australian or governments and so forth, and you've got other leaders who are appointed by the people. So, you know.
So has this body gone a long way to replacing, I suppose, if that's the right word, ATSIC? I mean, because ATSIC being abolished.
Very, very different model. We intentionally didn't want to establish another ATSIC, and this is where we're getting into another pet subject now, where the new independent entity they're talking about has got real issues, because ATSIC was a representative body, an elected body, but the executive, the commissioners, all came from the regional councils, and they were elected up, and a couple were appointed, but the chairs were appointed. But what happened was that they were given a number of programs to manage, and they had the funding and control over those. But there were a lot of other programs that they had no control over, and yet everybody said if there's a failure in education, as an example, then that's ATSIC's problem. It wasn't. ATSIC had no say over education. They were developing education policy just before they were shut down, and that's going to be the problem of the new entity that's being proposed, as I see it, because they're supposedly going to advise the government. Well, we know that the government doesn't necessarily take advice well, and from anybody, including their own Senate or House of Reps committees that they go out and look at issues, and those reports just get, shelved. Very rarely recommendations, enacted. So that's not really going to be the way forward, in my view, because they'll be blamed for everything. And the other issue is that we're very keen for mainstream to meet their obligations. They control over 90% of the funding for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the Indigenous Pacific is only a very small percentage, less than 10%. So why would we allow mainstream to abrogate their responsibility, and all the blame gets put on the Indigenous body? So for me, there's got a lot of flaws in that, and we'd be better off going towards a dedicated Senate Estimates Committee of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that's where the real bite takes place in the parliamentary system.
But Jessa raised a couple of key points, particularly about the dominance of men. And yes, there is a dominance of men in areas, but any smart Aboriginal man will always tell you there's a strong Aboriginal woman behind them. Now, in this room, there's about 8 young Aboriginal women. You're a role model. What's your message for them?
Keep pushing, don't give up, and band together. Women, when we band together, can achieve anything. And I've got a saying that I always think of: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Wonderful.